Most of the men who were to become Hitler's closest subordinates were now in the party or would shortly enter it. Rudolf Hess joined in 1920. Son of a German wholesale merchant domiciled in Egypt, Hess had spent the first 14 years of his life in that country and then come to the Rhineland for his education. During the war he served for a time in the List Regiment with Hitler, though they did not become acquainted then, and after being twice wounded became a flyer. He enrolled in the University of Munich after the war as a student of economics, but seems to have spent much of his time distributing anti-Semitic pamphlets and fighting with the various armed bands then at loose in Bavaria. He was in the thick of the firing when the Soviet regime in Munich was overthrown on May 1, 1919, and was wounded in the leg. One evening a year later, he went to hear Hitler speak, was carried away by his eloquence, and joined the party, and soon he became a close friend, a devoted follower and secretary of the leader. It was he who introduced Hitler to the geopolitical ideas of General Karl Haushofer, then a professor of geopolitics at the university. Hess had stirred Hitler with a prize-winning essay which he wrote for a thesis entitled, "How Must the Man Be Constituted Who Will Lead Germany Back to Her Old Heights?" Where all authority has vanished, only a man of the people can establish authority. The deeper the dictator was originally rooted in the broad masses, the better he understands how to treat them psychologically, the less the workers will distrust him, the more supporters he will win among these most energetic ranks of the people. He himself has nothing in common with the mass. Like every great man, he is all personality. When necessity commands, he does not shrink before bloodshed. Great questions are always decided by blood and iron. In order to reach his goal, he is prepared to trample on his closest friends. The lawgiver proceeds with terrible hardness. As the need arises, he can trample them, the people, with the boots of a grenadier. No wonder Hitler took to the young man. This was a portrait perhaps not of the leader as he was at the moment, but of the leader he wanted to become, and did. For all his solemnity and studiousness, Hess remained a man of limited intelligence, always receptive to crackpot ideas, which he could adopt with great fanaticism. Until nearly the end, he would be one of Hitler's most loyal and trusted followers and one of the few who was not bitten by consuming personal ambition. Alfred Rosenberg, though he was often hailed as the intellectual leader of the Nazi Party, and indeed its philosopher, was also a man of mediocre intelligence. Rosenberg may with some truth be put down as a Russian. Like a good many Russian intellectuals, he was of Baltic German stock. The son of a shoemaker, he was born January 12, 1893, at Reval, now Tallinn, in Estonia, which had been a part of the Tsarist Empire since 1721. He chose to study not in Germany but in Russia, and received a diploma in architecture from the University of Moscow in 1917. He lived in Moscow through the days of the Bolshevik Revolution, and it may be that, as some of his enemies in the Nazi Party later said, he flirted with the idea of becoming a young Bolshevik revolutionary. In February 1918, however, he returned to Reval, volunteered for service in the German army when it reached the city, was turned down as a Russian, and finally, at the end of 1918, made his way to Munich, where he first became active in White Russian émigré circles. Rosenberg then met Dietrich Eckart, and through him Hitler, and joined the party at the end of 1919. It was inevitable that a man who had actually received a diploma in architecture would impress the man who had failed even to get into a school of architecture. Hitler was also impressed by Rosenberg's learning, and he liked the young Balt's hatred of the Jews and the Bolsheviks. Shortly before Eckart died, toward the end of 1923, Hitler made Rosenberg editor of the Völkischer Beobachter, and for many years he continued to prop up this utterly muddled man, this confused and shallow philosopher, as the intellectual mentor of the Nazi movement and as one of its chief authorities on foreign policy. Like Rudolf Hess, Hermann Göring had also come to Munich some time after the war, ostensibly to study economics at the university, and he too had come under the personal spell of Adolf Hitler. One of the nation's great war heroes, the last commander of the famed Richthofen fighter squadron, holder of the Pour le Mérite, the highest war decoration in Germany, He found it even more difficult than most war veterans to return to the humdrum existence of peacetime civilian life. He became a transport pilot in Denmark for a time and later in Sweden. One day he flew Count Erich von Rosen to the latter's estate some distance from Stockholm, and while stopping over as a guest fell in love with Countess Rosen's sister, Karin von Konsau, née Baroness Fock, one of Sweden's beauties. Some difficulties arose. Karin von Konsau was epileptic and was married and the mother of an 8-year-old son. But she was able to have the marriage dissolved and marry the gallant young flyer. Possessed of considerable means, she went with her new husband to Munich, where they lived in some splendor, and he dabbled in studies at the university. But not for long. He met Hitler in 1921, joined the party, contributed generously to its treasury, and to Hitler personally, threw his restless energy into helping Röhm organize the stormtroopers, and a year later, in 1922, was made commander of the SA. A swarm of lesser-known and for the most part more unsavory individuals joined the circle around the party dictator. Max Amann, Hitler's first sergeant in the List Regiment, a tough, uncouth character but an able organizer, was named business manager of the party and the Völkischer Beobachter, and quickly brought order into the finances of both. As his personal bodyguard, Hitler chose Ulrich Graf, an amateur wrestler, a butcher's apprentice, and a renowned brawler. As his court photographer, the only man who for years was permitted to photograph him, Hitler had the lame Heinrich Hoffmann, whose loyalty was dog-like and profitable, making him in the end a millionaire. Another favorite brawler was Christian Weber, a horse dealer, a former bouncer in a Munich dive, and a lusty beer drinker. Close to Hitler in these days was Hermann Esser, whose oratory rivaled the leader's and whose Jew-baiting articles in the Völkischer Beobachter were a leading feature of the party newspaper. He made no secret that for a time he lived well off the generosity of some of his mistresses. A notorious blackmailer, resorting to threats to expose even his own party comrades who crossed him, Esser became so repulsive to some of the older and more decent men in the movement that they demanded his expulsion. "I know Esser as a scoundrel," Hitler retorted in public, "but I shall hold on to him as long as he can be of use to me." This was to be his attitude toward almost all of his close collaborators, no matter how murky their past, or indeed their present. Murderers, pimps, homosexual perverts, drug addicts, or just plain rowdies were all the same to him if they served his purposes. He stood Julius Streicher, for example, almost to the end. This depraved sadist, who started life as an elementary school teacher, was one of the most disreputable men around Hitler from 1922 until 1939, when his star finally faded. A famous fornicator, as he boasted, who blackmailed even the husbands of women who were his mistresses, he made his fame and fortune as a blindly fanatical anti-Semite. His notorious weekly, Der Stürmer, thrived on lurid tales of Jewish sexual crimes and Jewish ritual murders. Its obscenity was nauseating, even to many Nazis. Streicher was also a noted pornographist. He became known as the uncrowned king of Franconia, with the center of his power in Nuremberg, where his word was law and where no one who crossed him or displeased him was safe from prison and torture. Until I faced him slumped in the dock at Nuremberg, on trial for his life as a war criminal, I never saw him without a whip in his hand or in his belt, and he laughingly boasted of the countless lashings he had meted out. Such were the men whom Hitler gathered around him in the early years for his drive to become dictator of a nation which had given the world a Luther, a Kant, a Goethe and a Schiller, a Bach, a Beethoven, and a Brahms. On April 1, 1920, the day the German Workers' Party became the National Socialist German Workers' Party, from which the abbreviated name Nazi emerged, Hitler left the army for good. Henceforth he would devote all of his time to the Nazi Party, from which neither then nor later did he accept any salary. How, then, it might be asked, did Hitler live? His fellow party workers themselves sometimes wondered. In the indictment which the rebel members of the party committee drew up in July 1921, the question was bluntly posed. If any member asks him how he lives and what was his former profession, he always becomes angry and excited. Up to now, no answer has been supplied to these questions. So his conscience cannot be clean, especially as his excessive intercourse with ladies, to whom he often describes himself as King of Munich, costs a great deal of money. Hitler answered the question during the subsequent libel action which he brought against the authors of the pamphlet. To the question of the court as to exactly how he lived, he replied, "If I speak for the National Socialist Party, I take no money for myself. But I also speak for other organizations, and then, of course, I accept a fee. I also have my midday meal with various party comrades in turn. I am further assisted to a modest extent by a few party comrades." Probably this was very close to the truth. Such well-heeled friends as Dietrich Eckart, Goering, and Hans Stengel undoubtedly lent him money to pay his rent, purchase clothes, and buy a meal. His wants were certainly modest. Until 1929, he occupied a two-room flat in a lower-middle-class district in the Tirschstrasse near the river Isar. In the winter, he wore an old trench coat. It later became familiar to everyone in Germany from numerous photographs. In the summer, he often appeared in shorts, the lederhosen which most Bavarians donned in seasonable weather. In 1923, Eckart and Esser stumbled upon the Platterhof, an inn near Berchtesgaden, as a summer retreat for Hitler and his friends. Hitler fell in love with the lovely mountain country. It was here that he later built the spacious villa, Berghof, which would be his home and where he would spend much of his time until the war years. There was, however, little time for rest and recreation in the stormy years between 1921 and 1923. There was a party to build and to keep control of in the face of jealous rivals as unscrupulous as himself. The NSDAP was but one of several right-wing movements in Bavaria struggling for public attention and support, and beyond, in the rest of Germany, there were many others. There was a dizzy succession of events and of constantly changing situations for a politician to watch, to evaluate, and to take advantage of. In April 1921, the Allies had presented Germany the bill for reparations, a whopping 132 billion gold marks, $33 billion, which the Germans howled they could not possibly pay. The mark, normally valued at 4 to the dollar, had begun to fall. By the summer of 1921, it had dropped to 75, a year later to 400 to the dollar. Erzberger had been murdered in August 1921. In June 1922, there was an attempt to assassinate Philipp Scheidemann, the socialist who had proclaimed the Republic. The same month, June 24th, Foreign Minister Rathenau was shot dead in the street. In all three cases, the assassins had been men of the extreme right. The shaky national government in Berlin finally answered the challenge with a special law for the protection of the Republic, which imposed severe penalties for political terrorism. Berlin demanded the dissolution of the innumerable armed leagues and the end of political gangsterism. The Bavarian government, even under the moderate Count Lerchenfeld, who had replaced the extremist Kahr in 1921, was finding it difficult to go along with the national regime in Berlin. When it attempted to enforce the law against terrorism, the Bavarian rightists, of whom Hitler was now one of the acknowledged young leaders, organized a conspiracy to overthrow Lerchenfeld and march on Berlin to bring down the Republic. The fledgling democratic Weimar Republic was in deep trouble, its very existence constantly threatened not only from the extreme right but from the extreme left.